You know, my friends, with as many developments as we have seen over the past month, I was not expecting controversy to break out in Germany because of the German Chancellor's comments about 80% of Syrian refugees being returned back to their home country. Because yes, that is actually something that did happen. Or to be more specific, at the beginning of April of 2026, Germany's Chancellor Friedrich Merz would go and say that he and the Syrian president Ahmed al-Shara had had a meeting and they hoped that 80% of the Syrians in Germany would return home in the next 3 years. And I know that at the time that I am making this video, it is now mid-April heading into late April, and that's late April or the end of April is when this video is going to release. So who knows how much that information could actually change, but we still had to give it some time in order to be able to stew over because this is a really big deal and no one really knew what was going to happen or why or how or anything. And also because I did lose the previous version of this video because my computer went and died on me. So yeah, that sucks. And if you want to support me, you can check out my merch, where we just launched the new Gladbod shirt that I don't even have the sample of here yet from my production company. So yeah, there's that. And also Patreon, of course, which is still helpful because I have to replace my car after last month too. Dear God, it has been a time. But hey, my friends, before we continue with this video, I feel like I should go ahead and give you all a heads up. As you know, when it is that I travel, things tend to happen. And I actually have some upcoming group travel that you can join me on because we all the other ones kind of sold out, but I do have spots that still are remaining for my Estonia trip, which is Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. We're going to the Christmas markets there, and that's going to be awesome. And actually, this month, we literally just launched China, and that is going to be the following year, and already 14 out of the 22 spots are sold. So if you want to go on an Asian adventure with me and potentially see things happen over in that sphere of the world, then you should join us. For the rest of you, though, I'll see you in the bunker. Still, going back to the actual story, people may not really understand just how big of a deal this is. Over the course of the civil war in Syria, almost 1 million Syrians would seek refuge in Germany. And that, mind you, when we say that number, that is just the Syrians. There are many other immigrant groups in Germany that are facing increased scrutiny as time has gone on. And in this case, speaking after a meeting with Shara in Berlin, Chancellor Merz would say that after more than a year of the end of the civil war, the situation in Syria had, quote, now changed fundamentally. And that, quote, the need for protection must therefore be reassessed, end quote. Which, okay, sure, I guess that sounds all well and good, but there was basically no detail as to how the returns would come about, which should honestly surprise no one considering how complex of an issue it has become over the last decade or so and the sheer numbers that we are talking about. Although it's not the first time that Merz has urged Syrians to return home to help rebuild their country following its long and brutal civil war that only ended in late 2024, his latest remarks have drawn significantly more backlash. As Social Democratic Party or SPD lawmaker Aydin Özgür would tell Politico, quote, what remains is a figure with no plan, no legal basis, and no respect for so many people who are part of our society, end quote. Which, I mean, hey, if you go and remove some of the more politically charged moral language, there is a point there. There isn't really a plan in place or even proposed, just sentiment. On top of that, members of the SPD, Merz's center-left coalition partner, have grown very frustrated with the chancellor's tough migration policies, from doing deals with the Taliban regime allowing Berlin to deport migrants to Afghanistan, to turning away asylum seekers at Germany's borders. All measures that are tapping into the building popular anti-immigration and more right-wing sentiments that are not only within the country, but all across Europe. These things have been growing. Mind you, when I am talking about this, I am not saying that dismissively, I am not saying that politically or pejoratively or any. I'm not describing any of these as inherently bad, whether you are pro or against or anything like that. It is simply a fact that more right-wing parties are on the rise across Europe that is changing the political landscape as we know it. So, as to what is to happen with any new Syrian migrants or those that remain, we will have to address what is currently happening or will happen at the end of today's video. So we're going to get to that. The more important question that we always try to answer here on the history of everything is, how exactly did we get here? Why is Europe turning against immigration? And what is possibly going to happen next? Well, to answer all of these questions, we need to begin by taking a step back first and looking at Germany pre-Syrian civil war. Yes, most channels are probably going to dive right into the conflict and the immediate after effects of the Syrian civil war, but I need you to understand the bigger picture here. I would be doing a disservice otherwise. To that end, we actually need to go back in time to the 1940s and the aftermath of World War II, the thing that started modern Germany on its immigration spree out of sheer necessity. And allow me to explain. What I am talking about here, my friends, is that in the immediate aftermath of 1945, Germany lay basically in ruins. Its population was decimated by an estimated 7 to 9 million deaths, and further altered by the redrawing of its borders. The most significant initial demographic shock was the forced expulsion of between 12 and 14 million ethnic Germans from former Eastern territories like Silesia, Pomerania, and East Prussia, as well as from the Eastern European countries. This colossal internal migration, with approximately 8 million of these expellees resettling in the remaining territory that would become West Germany, would create immense pressure on housing and resources, sure, but it would also provide a human foundation for the subsequent economic recovery that we would see in the following decades. West Germany was already the industrial powerhouse of the previous states, and this at least gave it some of its potential workers back that had been lost over the course of the war. The East, however, the East was not so lucky. The 1949 division of the country into the Federal Republic of Germany, the FRG in the West, and the German Democratic Republic, the GDR in the East, effectively set the stage for two diverging demographic paths, with the West aligning with more capitalist labor importing models, while the East would adhere more to a further controlled socialist approach. If you then go and fast forward by a bit, and the West German Wirtschaftswunder, or which I'm probably butchering the pronunciation of considering that I don't speak German, but this basically meaning the economic miracle of Germany of the 1950s and 60s, this would end up being the primary catalyst for the first major wave of post-war immigration. Because facing a critical labor shortage in its booming industrial sector, West Germany would go and initiate a series of bilateral recruitment agreements, starting with Italy in 1955, and then expanding to include Greece, Turkey, Spain, Portugal, Morocco, Tunisia, and Yugoslavia. These agreements brought millions of Gastarbeiter, or guest workers, to Germany under the explicit assumption that their presence in the country was temporary as guest workers. And among all the populations that I listed, the Turkish community became the largest and most significant of these groups, with over 2 million of them arriving between 1961 and 1973 alone. And this is when the country was significantly smaller in terms of population. These workers were initially housed in dormitories and socially segregated, with very little expectation of integration ever taking place. However, reality has a way of making things complicated. And the 1973 oil crisis and the subsequent end of recruitment did not actually trigger their departure. Instead, it transformed the nature of immigration as the German government, facing international pressure and the reality of established communities who, weirdly enough, don't want to remain as good little cogs in a machine and actually want to, do crazy things like have families and lives of their own. I know, super weird. This shifted the German stance to allowing family reunification, leading to the permanent settlement of these once temporary workers and the birth of an entirely new second German-born generation. At the same time that all of this was going down, West Germany was also managing immigration under its right of return policy, which granted citizenship to ethnic Germans that were still living in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. These Aussiedler and Spätaussiedler, or late immigrants, would arrive in waves, especially after the fall of the Iron Curtain, which would add another complex layer to the whole messy demographic picture that we are looking at. The German Democratic Republic, in contrast, would maintain a significantly stricter and much more ideologically driven immigration policy. It recruited a small number of contract workers from fellow socialist nations like Vietnam, Mozambique, and Cuba, but these individuals were isolated from the East German population. They lived in segregated dormitories, and they were expected to return home after their contracts were up, with virtually no path to citizenship or permanent settlement at all. The stark difference highlighted the ideological chasm between the two Germanys, with the West becoming a de facto country of immigration through economic necessity, while the East largely remained homogenous as a state until its eventual collapse in 1990. But that right there is the next crucial detail that we have to address here. Because the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and German reunification in 1990 would initiate a brand new and very complex phase of demographic change. The immediate effect, of course, was a massive internal migration from the economically stagnant East to the far more prosperous West, which would drain the former GDR of many of its young and skilled workers and exacerbate any demographic imbalances that already existed there. Externally, the collapse of communism across Eastern Europe would also open the floodgates for ethnic Germans from the former Soviet Union, with hundreds of thousands of these arriving in the early 1990s. These new arrivals oftentimes faced significant integration challenges, as their German language skills were poor in comparison by this point. Even if they were ethnically German, German was not exactly a popular language in Soviet-controlled countries here at this time, and their cultural backgrounds were far more aligned with the Soviet system than with Western Germany and its more capitalist open models. Ethnic Germans from the former Soviet Union, the Ostler, they began to arrive in enormous numbers, totaling around 2.3 million people between 1990 and 2005. At the same time that all of this was going down, the wars in Yugoslavia would push hundreds of thousands of Bosnian, Croatian, and later Kosovar refugees all towards Germany as well, which at the time was actually the most generous asylum regime in all of Europe, thanks to a little thing called Article 16 of the Basic Law, which was drafted in response to Nazi-era persecution. If you're wondering just how generous of a thing we're talking about here, the asylum clause was nearly unconditional, and numbers would surge past 400,000 applications in 1992 alone. As you can probably expect from just how big of numbers we're talking about here, the backlash was pretty ferocious. Far-right violence would explode in the early 1990s, with arson attacks on asylum hostels and Turkish families becoming national scandals. You had things like Hoyerswerda, Rostock-Lichtenhagen, Mölln, and Solingen, which all remain dark reference points in German memory. It was not exactly a fun time, it was extremely chaotic. And so, in 1993, under immense pressure, the Bundestag, which is basically the German parliament, or Congress if you will, they would go and pass the Asylum Compromise, which sharply narrowed Article 16 by declaring that anyone who was arriving through a safe third country could be turned away. And now, because Germany was surrounded entirely by safe third countries, this effectively closed the land border to asylum applications. At least for a while. This system would erode in practice ever since, and that is something that has led to significantly greater problems now, but at the time, this is what they had done in response. So, throughout this period, German politicians across the spectrum would continue to repeat the mantra that Germany was, and again, I'm going to butcher this, kein Einwanderungsland, which is not a country of immigration. Even though the data at this point, considering we were talking about 50 years of necessary immigration that had been done for German industry, all this data plainly showed completely otherwise. And honestly, this denial is something that had real consequences. As for decades, Germany really failed to invest in solid integration infrastructure, good language programs, coherent paths to citizenship, precisely because they refused to admit what they were becoming. That is, of course, until the turning point finally came about in 2005 with the Zuwanderungsgesetz, or Immigration Act, something that was passed under Chancellor Gerhard Schröder. Now, for the first time, Germany would formally acknowledge itself as a country of immigration, creating a federal office for migration and refugees, the BAMF office, and they began to rebuild the integration core system that remains in place today. Citizenship reform in the year 2000 had already introduced limited birthright citizenship for children that were born in Germany to long-term foreign residents, which was a major break with the traditional, more blood-based sanguinis path that they had had here before. These reforms were incremental and incomplete, to be sure, but they still marked a genuine shift in self-understanding for how the German state operated. Now, mind you, again, I need to stress this right now. My point of Germany becoming a country of immigration is something that was done largely out of necessity for industries to grow, and also because Germany had been severely below replacement levels with their birth rate for decades at this point. All of this contributes to it. So we're not taking a moral stance. We're not taking any kind of stance like that. No, no, no. We are simply stating the facts for why something was done out of necessity. In fact, if you go and fast forward by a lot, as we still have more to cover, Germany's birth rate in 2025 had dropped to like 1.35, which is well below the 2.1 replacement mark, and that figure is even lower for women with German citizenship. Immigrants are actually the ones that are boosting the birth rate for statistics, not just the general population numbers. So if you took away immigrant birth rates, the actual German birth rate would drop significantly lower. This decline, reflected in other parts of the EU, raises massive alarms over pension burdens and the future workforce, which we will be talking about more here and for other countries as time goes on. I'm sure that I have a lot more videos to make about the subject. Needless to say, what we are covering here then is not anything new. But now it is finally time that we get to the meat of the issue that inspired this video in the first place: the Syrian refugee crisis. The great rupture of the 21st century would come about in 2015. The Syrian civil war, which had begun in 2011, was by its fourth year producing catastrophic levels of displacement, not just internally, but sending people abroad thousands of miles. With the rise of ISIS in 2014 pushing conditions in Turkish, Lebanese, and Jordanian refugee camps way past the breaking point. That summer, as bodies were washing up on Greek beaches and Hungarian authorities were blocking rail travel westward, hundreds of thousands of people began to walk across the Balkans towards Germany. On August 31st, 2015, Chancellor Angela Merkel would go and announce that Germany was going to suspend the Dublin regulation, this being something that would normally require asylum claims to be processed in the first EU country of their arrival for Syrians. Her now famous phrase, "Wir schaffen das," "we can do this," became the defining slogan of the entire era. In 2015 alone, around 890,000 asylum seekers would register in Germany, followed by another 280,000 in 2016. The largest national group of this, of course, was the Syrians, but it was also followed by Afghan and Iraqi people as well. The initial German response was actually quite extraordinary. Volunteers would meet trains at Munich's main station with applause, with food, stuffed animals for children. Sports halls were converted into emergency accommodation centers overnight. Language schools, churches, sports clubs, all of them threw themselves into integration work at a truly impressive level. This phenomenon, known as Willkommenskultur, or welcome culture, genuinely surprised a lot of outside observers who expected Germany to be far more like they had been in the previous decades, way more insular. But that is not what happened, at least not initially. Now, before it is that we go any further, my friends, I do want to go ahead and add something here from me personally. Normally, I do not include many of my own personal stories, but I remember this time vividly from when I was in college. I remember the halls of my campus being flooded with posters, murals, slogans, all about the crisis. Fundraisers were everywhere. Speakers were being welcomed. And everywhere you looked, you would see people talking about the women and children of Syria that were suffering. And it's true, they absolutely were. But there was another problem that was being created at this point that was tied to the migration issue, that was being masked by thousands of images of destitute families that were seeking safety and refuge. The problem is that the majority of people that were migrating to Europe were not families, but rather largely single men. And it may be called the Syrian refugee crisis, but Syrians only made up a part of the millions upon millions of people that came into Europe over the course of the next decade from that point. In fact, if you go and look at the statistics of what we were talking about here, for asylum seekers in 2015 alone, around 29% of those that arrived were minors, 19% of them being male, and around 10% of them being female, and a minor in this case being someone that is between the ages of 0 and 17. In comparison to that, 42% of asylum seekers were young adult males, those of ages 8 to 34 years of age. In comparison to that, only 11% were young adult females. So overwhelmingly, the majority, the largest group of people that were arriving were young, military-age men. And now these age and gender patterns are largely consistent across some of the largest asylum seeker groups, including those from Syria, Iraq, Iran, Somalia, etc. The large proportion of young males and comparatively small shares of young adult women and female children suggest that many refugees from these source countries are young men that were traveling alone, not as families. And you could see this in any images of news coverage that was not edited to focus specifically on the women and children. This situation seems especially likely in the case of asylum seekers from Pakistan and Bangladesh, among whom 3/4 were males between 18 and 34 in 2015. Along with that, the percentage of unaccompanied minors among all asylum seekers to Europe would rise in 2015, reaching around 7% of all asylum applicants. Even from those numbers that I gave here before when talking about the age range of 0 to 17 as a minor, between 2008 and 2015, about 70 to 80% of those unaccompanied minors were boys of age 14 to 17, meaning that they were right on the verge of being men themselves. And they were not with families, they were unaccompanied. In fact, 39% of these unaccompanied minors came from Afghanistan. And look, before it is that I go any further, I need to specify. The reason I am bringing up these statistics is because of the inherent social problems that would follow that we will be addressing, and because anytime you talk about refugees, crisis, disasters, or any such things, naturally what is going to happen is that people are going to use very strong, emotional, and provocative language to try and elicit a response from their target audience because they want people to feel certain ways about things, whether that is positive or negative. This is why many pro-immigrant individuals would say, but think of all the women and children, while in actuality, they were the smallest groups. And anti-immigrant groups would say, well, look at the crime statistics. I am not saying that either one is incorrect per se, as the slant comes from a source of truth that supports their arguments, but it never really is the entire whole picture. That is all. That is what I wanted to add here because I remember all of the emotionally charged language that people were using at my own college back in the day, and how confused I was that the language and activism that I was seeing did not match the migration statistics, like at all. But that is all that I'm going to say there. Back to the actual Syrians in Germany, and this is where things get significantly more murky as well as possibly political, so we have to be as careful as we can here. As I said before, the scale of this migration was unprecedented. In 2015 alone, 890,000 people would arrive, declaring intent to seek asylum, the largest such movement to Germany since the early 1990s. Between 2015 and the end of 2016, roughly 1.2 million first-time asylum applications were lodged, with Syrians numbering around 425,000, Afghanis 158,000, and Iraqis 126,000, making up the largest groups. Between 2015 and 2024, Germany received over a third of all asylum applications made across the entirety of the EU, numbering nearly 8 million. Now that is an insane number, and remarkably, initial public support was quite strong. A September 2015 Politbarometer meter would find that 66% of Germans believed letting in large refugee flows was the right thing to do. But that is not something that was going to last. Hell, it wouldn't really last all that long. An ARD poll in July of 2015 found that only 38% of respondents felt that Germany should accept fewer refugees. But by 2025, that number had climbed to 68%, nearly doubling. And as for why that is the case, well, coincidentally enough, it turns out that when you suddenly bring in millions of people from completely different cultures, with a completely different language, with completely different views on society, government, religion, women, etc., there tends to be a kind of natural friction that exists. And when the largest portion of said population are young military-age men, well, historically, that has been an issue no matter when or where you are in the world. And I'm not talking about things from just like a refugee level. I mean, literally any point in history, this was always a recipe for trouble. To that end, I have to highlight several examples of this without going into too much detail, or sadly, we're going to be here all day. As it was, the single most pivotal moment would come on New Year's Eve of 2015 to 2016 in Cologne. That night, hundreds of women would report sexual assaults and robberies in Cologne, with police reports eventually citing over 1,200 victims. The perpetrators were overwhelmingly described as groups of men of North African and Arab origin, many of them recent asylum seekers. And initially, police and media actually attempted to downplay the incident. And this is something that backfired spectacularly when the truth emerged, which basically destroyed all public trust and supercharged anti immigrant narratives across the entire country that had already kind of been there in the background, but they didn't really have as much to go off of until here. This was to be the first of many incidents that would follow in the year 2016 alone. There was the Wurzburg train attack in July of 2016, where an Afghan refugee would attack passengers with an axe while shouting in Arabic, "God is great." You know what that is. Investigations would later reveal that he was in contact with members of the Islamic State. You had the Ansbach bombing, also in July of 2016, where a Syrian asylum seeker would detonate a bomb accidentally, only managing to take himself out in front of a wine bar. And mind you, I say accidentally because he actually had plans to do way more, but he screwed up his own bomb in his backpack. And that was the end of him. Then, besides this, later you had the Berlin Christmas market attack in December of 2016, when a Tunisian failed asylum seeker by the name of Anis Amri would drive a truck into a crowd, killing 12. And the use of trucks and vehicles to commit mass acts of terror is something that became commonplace over the latter 2010s. As this was going down, each attack would erode confidence in the government's ability to vet arrivals, and what I just listed here are the terror attacks. They're not even counting the drastic increases in crime, notably of the more intimate variety that you would see against women. As a result of this, public sentiment would rapidly turn sour, and forces that were previously more on the political fringe and hadn't had any real power or authority in Germany for decades would move in. Right-wing populists would form groups like Pegida, which is the patriotic Europeans against the Islamization of the Occident, to organize major street protests. Now, technically, they began back in 2014, not 2015 and 2016, but they would grow rapidly due to the events of the mid-2010s, and that would only help to support the rise of the Alternative for Deutschland, AfD party. And that right there, my friends, is something that I'm going to really need to dive into, because in order to understand what is going on in Germany right now, you need to understand just how powerful this party is, as well as how and why they grew so rapidly. I could, technically speaking, do an entire video on them, but that is unnecessary as we're going to cover their background here as it's relevant to the current story. The Alternative for Deutschland party was something that was born in February of 2013 out of a intellectual revolt rather than a street movement or anything like that. Its founders, economists like Bernd Luck, Hans Olaf Henkel, and Konrad Adam, they were not populists necessarily. No, they were more respected establishment figures that believed that Angela Merkel had betrayed German fiscal conservatism by agreeing to bail out Greece and other southern Eurozone members during the sovereign debt crisis, which is something that we've talked about here multiple times before. There were a lot of entities that were not necessarily happy with the bailouts that were taking place at this time. In fact, for anyone who denies this, the party's name itself, Alternative for Deutschland, was a rebuke to Merkel's repeated insistence that there was no alternative to her Euro rescue policies. So they were saying, no, we are the alternative. This is what you could do instead. In the early phase, the AfD was essentially a professor's party. It was Eurosceptic, it was fiscally orthodox, and it was culturally conservative, but it wasn't primarily focused on immigration yet. And despite the backlash that Merkel would see, the AfD wasn't powerful yet. It would narrowly miss entering the Bundestag in September of 2013 in the federal elections because it only got 4.7% of the vote. As a new party, that's actually pretty good, but it is just below the 5% threshold that is necessary to enter the Bundestag. But this is something that signaled that a space existed to Merkel's right that the CDU, or the Christian Democratic Union, had abandoned as she moved her party more towards the center. So what happened then? Well, the defining rupture would come about in 2015, when Merkel would make the fateful decision to keep Germany's borders open during the Syrian refugee crisis, ultimately allowing in over 1 million asylum seekers within roughly just a year. As I talked about before, her famous phrase, "Wir schaffen das, we can do it," became both a rallying cry for her supporters, but it also became a slogan that her critics could throw right back at her face for the next decade because of the problems that Germany would see. Within the AfD, this crisis would trigger an internal split. As it was, Frauke Petry, who is a more nationalist figure, would oust Luck at the July 2015 Essen Party Congress, something that would prompt Luck and many of the original founders to leave because this wasn't the way that they wanted their party to go. The party, from this point, would rapidly begin to absorb new membership bases, drawing from more German identitarian, nationalist, and similar circles. From this point, immigration, Islam, and German cultural identity, that would displace the euro as the central obsession of the party, something that began to rapidly resonate with much of the German population. Thus it was that by 2017 in the federal election then, the AfD had transformed itself into the People's Voice of Migration Backlash, and they would enter the Bundestag with a whopping 12.6% of the vote, becoming the third largest party and the first avowedly nationalist force in German parliament since the end of the Second World War. Now, okay, pause. I need to stress this right now. Just because I am using the term nationalist and right-wing populist, this does not mean Nazi. Like, holy crap, I need to make this very clear because I know exactly what it is that I see in the comment section every time I talk about varying different left-wing groups or right-wing groups, and it's just, it always goes off the rails. There is a party that is like that still in Germany, and that is the Homeland Party, formerly known as the NDP or the National Democratic Party. That is a far-right neo-Nazi and ultranationalist political party that was founded back in 1964 as the successor to the German Reich Party. Since its founding, though, the party has never managed to win enough votes on the federal level to ever cross the 5% minimum threshold to get representation in the Bundestag, even if, on occasion, they have won a seat or two a few times in state parliaments. So yeah, that is the group that you could more accurately call Nazis. The AfD as a whole are not that, even if their views on some issues or by some individuals in the party may seem to be more unpalatable to you. And again, there are definitely less desirable factions within the party that you could point out there. Easily, one of the most annoying things in the modern day and age is everyone you don't like being labeled a communist or a Nazi or something or the other like that. I will be making a video on that exact topic, the whole thing for the labeling of political parties and what political labels actually mean, but that is for the future and I don't want to get distracted here again. Essentially, the fear-amplifying backdrop of Islamist attacks across all of Europe, not just in Germany, would further fuel the shift within the AfD that was taking place. The years between 2017 and 2024 would see the AfD radicalize rather than moderate, even as they entrenched themselves electorally. The Eastern state associations, especially Thuringia under Björn Höcke, would become dominant within the party. Höcke, a former history teacher, is a guy that we actually need to be very careful with when describing because his stances are very easy to construe one way or another with history. And this is one of those things that when I'm talking about this, you could describe a lot of what he says as unpalatable, even if there are some points in some things. And I need to stress this. I need to stress this right now because holy crap, I know there's going to be so many fights in the comment section about this. What I mean is that Höcke has stated such things as, quote, "The big problem with Hitler is that he is spoken of as absolute evil, but nothing in history is black or white," end quote. Okay, again, definitely not political palatable, not a thing that you want to say, but the comment about history not being black or white is something that I've had to explain to you many times here as well. Reality is complicated, but for Germany, the past 80 years or so has been something arguably far more absolute, at least the way that things are talked about and presented. This is an individual that believes that Germans have been denied the right to national pride, an expression due to their country's very obvious dark history. From that, he has questioned the amount of time that German schools spend teaching students about Nazis, even going as far as to call the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, quote, "a monument of shame," end quote. That Germany is the only country in the world with such a monument of their shame in their capital, and as such, he wants a 180-degree change in memory policy. Those are direct quotes. Those are direct quotes from things that he has said. He wants something to make Germans proud again. You could probably understand from everything that I've been talking about here why people would have certain ideas of him or call him certain types of names or political labels. Because of these and other statements, in September of 2019, a German court actually ruled that describing Hawk as a fascist was not libelous. And this of course, is a big deal, and naturally you as a listener would think, oh, okay, so the court says he is a Nazi, right? Since that wouldn't be libel. But no, that's not what that means. A later court ruling in 2020 would rule against the FDP politician Sebastian Saja for stating that the court ruling had classified Hawk as a fascist. Because it didn't. It was only saying that you could not get in trouble for the opinion of calling him a fascist because of similar viewpoints. It does not mean that he actually was one and was being labeled as such by the court. Look, it might sound trivial, I know, but I promise you that is incredibly important. And the reality is, some of these statements that he and others in the party made really did resonate with voters who felt that their government had largely abandoned them. Fast forward then to 2021, and the entire AfD party was placed under formal observation as a suspected extremist organization. This being when they were again the third largest party in the country. Then, in January of 2024, the investigative outlet Corrective would go and reveal that AfD politicians had attended a secret meeting in Potsdam with identitarians and wealthy donors to discuss mass remigration, or the forced removal of not only immigrants, but also of naturalized German citizens that were immigrants that were deemed to be insufficiently assimilated. This revelation would trigger large protests in Germany, the largest that had ever been seen in decades, with millions of people going out into the streets and marching against the party in cities all across the country. But despite this, the AfD's polling numbers barely dipped. And as tensions would rise in Europe, their power would too only rise. Because of this, the breakthrough would come about in 2024 and 2025. In September of 2024, the AfD would win the Thuringia state election outright. The first time that a far-right party had won a German state election since 1945, which is a symbolic earthquake, veritably, in a country whose post-war political identity was built on the idea that, okay, this outcome is absolutely impossible. There is no way it could ever happen again. But it did, and it's pretty obvious as to why it took place. A string of horrific migrant-perpetrated attacks would precede the months of the election. The Mannheim police stabbing, the Solingen Festival massacre committed by a rejected Syrian asylum seeker who should have already been deported, and later the Marburg Christmas market attack and the Aschaffenburg child stabbing. All of this fed directly into the party's narrative that the state had lost control of the borders and the streets. Later, in the February 2025 federal election, the AfD would come in second place, not third, second place, with roughly 20% of the entire vote, nearly doubling their results from 2021. Friedrich Merz' CDU still won the election, to be sure, but it was forced into an uncomfortable coalition with the SPD, the Social Democratic Party, and maintained the so-called Brandmauer, or firewall, against formally cooperating with the AfD. Which sounds all well and good, I guess, like, okay, so the government can continue to operate, right? Well, the alliance is not an easy one, and there have been occasions where compromise has had to be made. Merz had already fractured that firewall in January of 2025 when he passed a non-binding migration motion in the Bundestag with AfD votes, a taboo-breaking moment that dominated German political discourse for weeks and arguably normalized the AfD even further rather than isolating it. Along with that, Alice Weidel, the party's openly lesbian co-leader, and when I talk about this, I'm not talking about the CDU, the open lesbian co-leader of the AfD that actually lives with a Sri Lankan-born partner, she became the public face of the party, which would complicate opponents' desires to simply characterize the party as straightforwardly fascist or racist or anything like that. She is quite literally the antithesis of everything that people were preaching against the party about. Yeah, she is a really interesting figure, I could say that without a doubt, but we're not going to go into too much more detail about her. But my friends, all of this brings us to this year then, in 2026. The developments that took place in Syria, the sentiment that has built in Europe over the last decade, and what is supposed to come next. You need to understand what has happened in Germany, as I said here before, is not isolated. It is one front of a continent-wide realignment, as anti-immigrant feelings are on the rise. You have Giorgia Meloni's Fratelli d'Italia party that leads the Italian government. You have Geert Wilder's PVV that won most seats in the Dutch election of November 2023. You have Marine Le Pen's Rassemblement National party, which is consistently the largest single party in France and, technically speaking, should have come to power back in the 2024 snap elections, but they only didn't because the center party as well as the far left party teamed up together in order to avoid that. Actually, I say far left party, it's more like the left-wing coalition, since basically everything in France is a coalition, but I digress. You have the Sweden Democrats, who became the parliamentary kingmaker of the current Swedish government. You have Austria's FPO under Herbert Kickl, who won the September 2024 national election outright. You have Vox in Spain, Chega in Portugal, Fidesz in Hungary, though that now, of course, is something that is different. All of these different movements represent versions of the same phenomenon. And so, understanding why all this is happening, why anti-immigrant sentiment is on the rise, why right-wing parties are gaining more power, all of this requires us to move past more simplistic narratives on either side and examine their actual causes that tend to connect with one another, because everything is interlocked. It's all overlapping, and that complexity is something that basically everyone ignores. The most obvious factor is the sheer scale and pace of migration into a continent whose political institutions, housing markets, and welfare states were never designed to absorb it. Europe received waves of arrivals in 2015 and 2016 during the Syrian crisis, continuous Mediterranean and Balkan route flows since, and roughly 8 million Ukrainians after Russia's 2022 invasion. From here, they've also had increasing flows from sub-Saharan Africa, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. Integration capacity, the ability of schools, hospitals, housing stock, the labor market, welfare systems to absorb newcomers without visibly degrading services or for existing residents, that's not possible. They were simply overwhelmed in many places. When a German town of 30,000 people is asked to house 2,000 asylum seekers in a single year, that strain is not something that is abstract. It is visible at the supermarket, at the job center, at the local school, at the emergency room. You can see this. Voters notice this way before politicians ever go and acknowledge it. And so compounding the volume issue has been a steady drumbeat of high-profile violent incidents committed by asylum seekers and migrants, which function as political accelerants every single time they occur, like pouring lighter fluid on top of a small fire to turn it into an inferno. The Bataclan massacre in Paris in November of 2015, the Nice truck attack in July of 2016, the Berlin Christmas market attack in December of 2016, there was the Cologne attacks that I already talked about here, the Manchester Arena bombing in 2017, the Vienna attack in 2020, the October 2023 Brussels shooting, the Solingen Festival stabbing in 2024, the Magdeburg Christmas market attack in December of 2024, all of these things, and I'm only listing a couple of the things that have taken place, dominated news cycles for weeks and were repeatedly invoked by populist parties that wanted to showcase what was going on with immigration. Every incident would undermine people's trust in the state's ability to perform their most basic function, keeping citizens safe. And each one is treated by voters as a validation of warnings that mainstream media had dismissed as racist. Sexual assault cases, especially in the mass attacks on women in Cologne on New Year's Eve back in 2015 and 2016, this was arguably one of the most politically corrosive things that has happened in modern German history, because the initial attempt by local authorities and the media to downplay and hide them, which shattered trust in the information environment. On top of these overt things, cultural and religious friction is the layer that exists beneath said violence as a constant thing. Concerns about parallel societies, political Islam, anti-Semitism within migrant communities, honor-based violence, the status of women, and the compatibility of certain imported values with European liberal norms have migrated from the far-right fringe into mainstream conversation over the past decade. In fact, just as an example of this, of something that I personally have also seen a lot in the United States, and something that is seemingly commonplace, far more place around the world, is what would happen in the period following Hamas's October 7th, 2023 attack on Israel. This was especially significant because enormous pro-Palestinian and in some cases Openly pro-Hamas demonstrations would take place in Berlin, London, Paris, Malmo, and Amsterdam. And this would shock centrist European voters, many of whom had not previously registered the scale of political Islamism in their own cities. When thousands of people were marching, celebrating a massacre, or tore down posters of kidnapped children, or called for intifada in European capitals, it generated a kind of cultural backlash that benefited nationalist parties across the continent, regardless of whatever their actual policies in the Middle East were. And that is absolutely something that I'm going to have to address deeper in further videos, because eventually I'm going to have to talk about that more deeply. Besides that, though, the economic dimension is equally crucial and often underemphasized. People don't really look at the numbers as much as the graphic moral stories. Europe is in the grip of a severe housing crisis. Rents in Berlin, Amsterdam, Dublin, Lisbon, Madrid, all of these have roughly doubled in the past decade. And young, native Europeans are increasingly perceiving themselves as competing with migrants and refugees for an inadequate supply of apartments, subsidized housing, public services, and more. Post-COVID inflation, the energy price shock following Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the severing of Nord Stream gas supplies, the deindustrialization of Germany's export economy, and wage stagnation across southern Europe have all produced a generalized economic anxiety that makes voters way less tolerant of additional claimants for public resources. When people feel poorer and more precarious than their parents were at their own age, the political tolerance for generous asylum policies basically collapses. And that's not even counting the sheer amount of welfare fraud that also took place and became a very public issue. Perhaps the deepest driver is the repeated, visible failure of mainstream parties to enforce the rules that already existed on paper. The Dublin regulation was supposed to ensure that asylum seekers were processed in the first country of their entry, but in practice, it has been widely circumvented. Deportation orders against rejected asylum seekers are frequently not executed. The perpetrator of the Solingen attack was a rejected Syrian asylum seeker that should have been deported, but was not, which became the single most politically damaging fact in German politics in 2024. Because when voters see that the state has the legal authority to deport dangerous individuals and simply fails to do so, they conclude that centrist parties are either unwilling or incompetent, and they look elsewhere to make ends meet. The populist promise is not actually radical, it's often just the enforcement of laws that already exist, which is a devastatingly effective rhetorical position. So, when you go and combine all of these things, it is obviously not looking good. But then intersecting with all of this is a profound elite voter disconnect. Urban, university-educated professionals, journalists, NGO workers, civil servants, people who disproportionately staff the institutions that shape migration policy and public discourse, they tend to live in neighborhoods and work in sectors that experience immigration as a net positive thing. Oh, you get cheaper services, diverse restaurants, cultural enrichment, a professional colleague, all these kinds of things. It's positive for them. But working class and lower middle class voters in small towns and outer ring suburbs, whose schools receive the children of newcomers, whose neighborhoods change most visibly, whose wages compete most directly with migrants, experience immigration very differently. When these voters raise concerns, they frequently get labeled as just racist, xenophobic, or uneducated by precisely the elites whose neighborhoods and children's schools remain basically untouched. This asymmetry of experience and voice has been politically radioactive, and populist parties have managed to successfully position themselves as the only ones that are actually willing to validate the working class concerns of the population. Which should seem obvious, I suppose, but I don't want to spend the entire time just harping on the negatives, because, as I've explained here before, the reality is significantly more complicated than we would like to give it credit for. Because on top of everything that I have been talking about, demographic anxiety operates as a less spoken but still very powerful current beneath the surface, both for pro-immigration and anti-immigration sentiments. You need to understand that native European birth rates have collapsed. Italy, Spain, Germany, Greece all have fertility rates well below 1.5, way below replacement, which I will be doing more videos on here in the future. While migrant communities tend to have much higher fertility rates, at least for the first generation. The result is that visible demographic change can occur within a single generation in ways that would previously have taken several. Parties like the AfD explicitly frame this as existential, sometimes invoking the more inflammatory Great Replacement theory. Of course, the mainstream are naturally going to reject this framing as nothing more than a conspiracy, but a softer version of said conspiracy still underlies a very real concern that even if the Great Replacement is not deliberate, it is still happening. That the country that one grew up in is gradually becoming unrecognizable. And this resonates with voters whose towns have, in fact, changed substantially, and perhaps they want them to go back more to the way that they were. And that brings us to Syria. As the Assad regime collapsed at the end of 2024 and thousands of Syrians took to the streets in celebration, AfD co-leader Alice Weidel would go and seize the moment, posting on X that, quote, anyone in Germany who celebrates the free Syria clearly no longer has any reason to flee. They should return to Syria immediately, end quote. For the government, this was really all that they needed. The fall of Bashar al-Assad to Hayat Tahrir al-Sham forces would fundamentally change the legal situation by allowing the government to argue that Syria was no longer a place of generalized persecution, and the statistical collapse in Syrian asylum outcomes is very stark from here. In October of 2025, BAMF would go and decide on 3,134 Syrian applications, and they would grant protection to just 26 people, roughly 1 in 120. Recognition rates would crash from near 100% in 2024 to around 5% by late 2025. Across the EU, Syrian monthly asylum applicants would fall by 70% between October of 2024 and February of 2025. And Germany lost its position as the primary destination for Syrian applicants to France and Spain. And so, my friends, from here, this is where we finally get to the political flashpoint that started this whole video in late March to early April of 2026, when Chancellor Merz, after meeting the Syrian interim president Ahmed al-Shara in Berlin, would publicly declare that around 80% of Syrians in Germany should return over the next 3 years as a contribution to Syrian reconstruction. The backlash was immediate, and it came from multiple directions all at once. Syrian community organizations, the Greens, the left, human rights groups, and crucially, employer associations and hospital administrators all came out against this. The latter, which again I need to mention here, would state that if so many Syrians left, if the mass Syrian departures took place, that would devastate specific sectors of the German labor market. Within days, Merz was forced to walk back the pledge as unrealistic, saying it's only something that basically should happen. The walkback would reveal the fundamental contradiction of the government's position. Syrians are deeply integrated by any honest measure at this point. Roughly 68% of those in Germany for 8 years or more are employed. Of course, that still leaves 32% that are not, which is still a massive figure and is a big problem, but more than 160,000 have already obtained German citizenship. Nearly a quarter of the 1.3 million Syrians in Germany were born there. Over 250,000 Syrian children are enrolled in German schools, and almost 20,000 are in higher education. Mass return would not only be exceptionally legally complicated, it would also be economically self-harming in ways that are visible in just about every hospital emergency room, every construction site, every small business district in urban Germany. It is actually complicated. And what makes the current moment structurally different from the 1993 asylum compromise or other previous restrictive cycles is that the persistent electoral pressure has come from the AfD. In several 2026 polls, the AfD has polled level with or even ahead of the CDU, especially in eastern states where the party dominates. This creates an almost impossible tightrope for Merz. Every hardline concession that he makes risks legitimizing the AfD even more and their framing without actually satisfying the AfD voters, who still want more because it's not going far enough. Every retreat goes and risks alienating his own conservative base and strengthening the AfD further. The SPD coalition partner, meanwhile, has red lines that it cannot cross without losing its own left flank to the Greens and the further left. The Brandmauer or firewall against cooperation with the AfD, that is something that remains formally intact at the federal level, but it's under enormous strain. especially in state parliaments in Thuringia, Saxony, and Saxony-Anhalt, where AfD vote shares make a stable non-AfD majority increasingly difficult to assemble. It's just not possible to happen. It really is a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. And that, unfortunately, pretty much sums up Germany at this point. And so, beneath all the political drama that I've been talking about here lies an economic reality that really no German government, regardless of what party is in charge, can escape. This is something that makes almost everything that I have been talking about here not exactly pointless, but it complicates the picture further, and this is why I've been trying to express that the issue is not so cut and dry. The country of Germany faces a severe demographic crisis. Roughly 400,000 net immigrants per year are needed to simply stabilize the workforce, according to the most credible estimates, as the German population is rapidly aging. And this is something that could spell disaster over the course of the next couple of decades. The Skilled Immigration Act and the EU Blue Card framework remain firmly in place, and the new Work and Stay Agency is being launched in 2026 specifically to streamline skilled migration. The government is therefore trying to thread an extremely fine needle. They need to deport the wrong migrants while attracting the right ones. They need to signal toughness to the AfD while keeping hospitals also staffed and construction sites manned so that housing doesn't fall even further behind. Whether this needle can actually be threaded, though, whether a country can simultaneously be seen as expelling Syrians en masse and welcoming skilled workers from the same regions, that is the unresolved question that is hanging over German politics for the remainder of the decade. And that's not something that is going to really change, perhaps. That answer will define not only migration policy, but also the shape and confidence of German democracy itself. The reality is, my friends, should terror attacks in Europe continue to be seen, well, history has taught us that things can change quite rapidly. Even if I cannot predict the future, I can predict that it's not likely to go well. And unfortunately, with that, we're going to have to end things here today. The next couple of years are going to prove to be very interesting, and by the time we get around to the next round of German federal elections, that could spell a massive change here in the future. But we have to wait for that moment. With that, my friends, we're going to be ending things here today. Thank you all very much for watching. I really do appreciate it. If you could like and comment on this video, if you could support me on Patreon, if you could check out my merch, do the things that actually help me, considering that, again, a lot of the things that I'm even talking about when I do things on this channel are very complex. They are very political at times, even if I'm not trying to be political, and considering the dark issues we are usually talking about, that can also lead to problems with YouTube. So any of your support that you can provide, I would appreciate. Thank you all very much. I'll see you next time, and goodbye, my friends.